Unaware that the next few minutes would completely upend her existence, she entered with a smile on her face and, in a matter of seconds, doctors revealed a fact that no mother should hear, causing Catherine's composed facade to crumble and tears to flow down her cheeks. Why was this test kept a secret up until now? Why did the palace not anticipate this? Furthermore, what does this mean for the monarchy and Prince Louis? Make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any updates before we delve deeper into what this actually implies for the royal family. It started off as a typical call, the same type Catherine had responded to innumerable times. A gentle request, a kind tone, no caution, and no urgency. However, there was something off about the timing, like if the air had changed before she even went over the boundary. There was a technique of whispering before speaking in the palace halls. The silence seemed overwhelming this time. The atmosphere inside was clinical, subdued, and far too serious for what she had been informed were everyday issues. Yes, Louis had undergone assessments, but she was told that nothing warranted panic, including developmental check-ins, precautionary check-ins, and routine monitoring. However, the expressions on the other side of her conveyed a different message. Precise phrases, deliberate pauses, and carefully selected words. Then came the language for which no parent is ready. Language that carried weight, words that seemed final. Physicians didn't make assumptions. They didn't become softer. They spoke as though this moment had just been postponed rather than discovered, as though the conclusion had been reached long ago. And she broke because of that weight. The knowledge that something this dangerous had been developing covertly behind protocol's assurances. Catherine's poise broke, not subtly, as reality struck in. Insiders would subsequently describe the sound of a chair scraping back, a loud intake of breath, and shaky palms. There was no confusion here. This was remorse merging with shock, the type that poses impractical queries. How could I have missed this? Before me, who knew? Why right now? The palace machineries came into operation in a matter of minutes. The phones stopped talking. Internal channels were shut down. Mid-sentence conversations came to a halt. Orders were given without justification. Aides quickly moved not to soothe, but to confine, include information, features a response. As Catherine was escorted away from curious onlookers, contain her. Witnesses claim that she vanished down a private hallway with a pale face, red eyes, and the weight of something permanent resting on her shoulders. Employees were told not to talk, not to guess, not to recall what they had seen, and not to play music since whatever had just been shown was not supposed to leave those walls. However, secrets have a way of seeping through gaps that initially go unnoticed. The palace was already preparing for the impact, while Catherine was left alone with the kind of anxiety that completely changes a mother's world, realizing that this moment could not be lost forever. However, in order to fully comprehend the gravity of this situation, we must return to the symptoms that went unnoticed and the indicators that the palace attempted to overlook. He was the playful light of the palace. However, beneath Louis's mischievous smile were subtle cues that were overlooked by many, disregarded by others, and written off as a passing phase. In retrospect, those symptoms seem frightening. Who buried the clues and what were they? Little things that were initially hardly noticed were the beginning. Word formation delays, instances of poor coordination, and silent pauses during play that were once thought to be the product of imagination but now cause concern. With appearances, engagements, orchestrated photo sessions, and the expectation that Prince Louis would smile on cue, the royal calendar moved quickly. However, there were times of uncertainty, and a silence that no one wanted to identify beneath those thoughtfully chosen pictures. Workers started to observe how quickly Louis would get tired at events. After waving for a few minutes, she clung to Catherine's hand, clearly exhausted. Videos of him dozing off at ceremonies and blinking slowly have leaked online. It was deemed cute by fans. He was just overwhelmed, according to commentators. However, a few insiders started whispering. There was an uneasy feeling. The nanny was the first to cautiously and softly say it out loud to a senior assistant. She had witnessed the growth of other kids. Louis was not like that. She observed that he had trouble following directions, was unsteady on his feet and frequently froze when overstimulated. She was expressing concern rather than terror. However, worrying about the royal machine can be risky. It was heard by Catherine. Long before she was informed, she sensed it. Mothers always do. She knew something wasn't right because of the deep, unspoken connection she shared with Louis. However, she was met with clipped assurances and tight smiles each time she raised it or when her voice faltered in concern. Boys developed differently, they claimed. He's under a spotlight, they continued. He just needs time. However, she wasn't afraid of time. They were squandering time by ignoring it. Once joyful family videos were now replayed as ominous portents. Louis didn't answer his name in his birthday video. The picture of the garden where he gazed off for far too long, his expression blank. Catherine started going over them repeatedly, searching for patterns and pleading for a misunderstanding. However, the reality was just becoming more apparent. Experts had already been surreptitiously and silently approached. Catherine desired assurance, answers, not etiquette or tabloid rumors. The tests were ordered, however they stalled somewhere between the request and the execution. Pause had been purposefully pressed by someone in the palace. The logic seemed obvious. Timing, privacy, optics, but the price is unacceptable. Louis was sliding through the gaps of an organization that was too preoccupied with maintaining its reputation, and was starting to breach that quiet for the woman who had always followed the rules, who had learnt to live gracefully in the tight grip of royal duty. And precisely when Catherine started asking for clarification, palace politics took over, starting a conflict between royal custom and a mother's intuition. She pleaded for clarification. They provided her with protocol. Catherine's silent petitions were met with resistance from advisors who were loyal to the monarch rather than to her inside the palace's opulent walls. Which secrets were they guarding, and to what extent did they postpone the truth? In the days that followed the first diagnosis, Catherine discovered that she was fighting an institution rather than a disease. She wasn't requesting headlines. She was requesting second opinions and talks with top experts in addition to the ones the palace had personally chosen. However, the response was always no, not yet, not necessary, not advisable, and below every well-crafted rejection conveyed the same message. Hold on, keep silent, remain in line, advisors urged prudence. The results were referred to as preliminary. They stressed that nothing was verified, that any mistake could set off a media frenzy, and that going outside of palace channels could raise needless concerns. However, Catherine perceived it as a much darker form of confinement. There was no investigation into the truth. It was under management. Every time she tried to get greater clarity, she encountered bureaucratic coldness, delays, or misdirection. It wasn't merely apathy. The opposition was deliberate. Long regarded as one of Catherine's closest allies, tensions soon developed between her and her personal secretary. According to others, she confronted him late one evening, her voice low but trembling with anger. "Why are you defending the organization rather than my son?" There was no response that could satisfy her, thus none did. William, who has always been the epitome of poise, was in a tight spot. He was a future king as well as a father. A man raised to serve something greater than himself, despite his intense love for his wife. Catherine relied on him. However, sources assert that he frequently took a cautious and conflicted approach. He asked for patience. In the process, he asked for faith. However, she was being suffocated by the process. Despite being fully educated and prepped, Charles's response was allegedly dismissive and even clinical. He discussed responsibility, story, and legacy. According to Catherine, he never once spoke the word Louis to her. That omission said it all. Then Camilla moved in the darkness. She refrained from speaking in public. She didn't have to. Behind the scenes, her influence was felt, modest but powerful. Many people think that Camilla's people were the ones who claimed that the future queen was getting harder to control, presented Catherine's worries as emotional overreactions, and urged against additional testing. Whispers became murmurs, and murmurs influenced choices. Catherine wasn't being disregarded. They were silencing her. Tradition and control weakened her voice, her mother's authority, and her intuition. Additionally, each door she knocked on closed a bit quicker. She was no longer struggling to find the answers. She was fighting to be allowed to ask any questions at all. However, the secrets of music can only be kept hidden for so long. Additionally, there was no trickle when the leak eventually occurred. The music exploded. It was not intended to escape, but everything was altered by a single encrypted message. The royal media was set on fire by an anonymous, terrifying, and unquestionably authentic leak that came from deep within the palace medical wing. Why now, and who leaked the music? The message showed up out of the blue. One encrypted email to a seasoned reporter who is renowned for uncovering news that others would not touch. It initially appeared unbelievable, too personal, too delicate, and too risky to be true. However, only a small number of persons inside the royal gates could have known the information contained in that file. The journalist didn't hesitate to use medical terminology, dates, observations, and details that were so exact and so unsettlingly correct. The narrative was too explosive to ignore. A firestorm broke out in a matter of hours. What looked to be an internal palace memo was included in the email. Devastating, clinical, cold, and it mentioned internal debates about sharing the results, described a diagnosis that had never been made public, and most incriminating of all, disclosed that the results had been known for weeks. The consequences were disastrous. A betrayal as well as a medical emergency. Not only is a child in danger, but a secretive system is collapsing from the inside out. There was widespread concern among the palace media crew. There was no communication. Meetings for emergencies were called. Controlling damage wasn't only essential, it was getting late. Now that the leak had escaped containment, it was on its own. It was quickly taken up by news organizations. The headlines were full of conjecture. Without verification, experts commented on the situation. Additionally, the hashtag number #PrayForLouis to become popular all over the world. Heartbroken and taken aback, the public wanted answers, but the palace was unable to provide any, not just yet. Catherine learned about it from her phone rather than from her husband or her assistants. A notification with a title that she hadn't approved, hadn't planned for, and hadn't even been informed about. According to insiders, she was upset at the quiet that had compelled someone to act covertly rather than the journalist or even the leak. In the establishment, where the only way to expose the truth was via desperation. Then the murmurs started. Who had carried it out? Was it a close friend or family member attempting to undermine Catherine from within? It was called an act of revolt by others. Others muttered about deliberate sabotage, a planned attempt to wreak havoc. And perhaps the most disturbing part of this entire story is not just the diagnosis, and not even the leak that shook the palace walls. It's the possibility that the truth may have been known long before the world ever heard a word about it. Inside the monarchy, silence has always been power. Secrets are protected, narratives are carefully controlled, and every revelation is timed with precision. But this time, something slipped through the cracks. A message that was never meant to leave the palace suddenly ignited a global storm. Now the questions are impossible to ignore. Who inside the royal system knew the truth about Prince Louis? Why were Catherine's concerns repeatedly delayed? And perhaps the most troubling question of all, was someone inside the palace trying to protect the monarchy or protect themselves? For Catherine, this is no longer about royal tradition, reputation, or protocol. This is about a mother fighting for her child in a system that was built to control every story. And if the leak has revealed anything, it's that the truth behind palace walls may be far more complicated than the public has ever imagined. But this story is far from over. Because when secrets begin to escape the palace, they rarely stop with just one revelation. If you want to stay updated on every twist